Growing up, I always thought my family was fairly typical. My parents, Mark and Linda, weren't wealthy, but they made sure that my sister Chloe and I had what we needed. Chloe was 2 years younger than me, and we got along well enough, though we each had our share of sibling squabbles. Our family life was predictable, comfortable in its own way, until my younger brother Alex came along. Alex wasn't planned. I overheard my parents arguing late one night when I was about 9 years old. Mom was upset, saying that they couldn't afford another child and that having a third was going to stretch them too thin. Dad tried to reassure her, but his voice carried the same uncertainty. Even at that age, I could tell Alex's arrival wasn't exactly welcomed. When Alex was born, things in our house shifted. Mom seemed perpetually stressed, and Dad worked overtime more often. Alex cried a lot, as babies do, but it seemed to grate on Mom's nerves more than I thought it should. She would sigh loudly whenever she had to pick him up, and I'd hear her muttering under her breath about how tired she was. At first, I didn't think much of it. Babies are hard work, right? But as Alex grew older, it became clear that the tension in the house wasn't just about the usual challenges of parenting. My parents didn't treat him the same way they treated me and Chloe. It wasn't obvious at first, but over time, the differences started adding up. One of the first things I noticed was how they handled his clothes. While Chloe and I had always gotten new outfits for birthdays or holidays, Alex was handed down our old ones. Sometimes they didn't even bother to buy him boys' clothes. He'd be sent to preschool in Chloe's old pink shirts or patterned leggings. I remember asking Mom about it once and she just shrugged, saying it didn't matter because he's too young to care. It wasn't just the clothes. My parents didn't celebrate his milestones the way they had with me or Chloe. When he learned to walk, I remember how excited I was, clapping and cheering as he toddled across the living room. But Mom barely looked up from her magazine, and Dad just nodded and said, "Good job, buddy," before going back to his phone. It was as if they couldn't muster the same enthusiasm for him that they had for us. As Alex got older, the differences became even starker. Chloe and I had toys that were new and tailored to our interests. Alex mostly got our old, broken ones or things my parents picked up secondhand. He never complained, but I could tell he noticed. I started catching him staring at Chloe's shiny new dollhouse or my pristine Lego sets with a mix of curiosity and sadness. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't know what to do about it. School was another challenge for Alex. He wasn't a bad student, but he struggled in ways Chloe and I didn't. While Chloe excelled in art and I did well in math, Alex was just average. My parents seemed to take this as another reason to treat him differently. When Chloe brought home an A on a project, she'd get ice cream as a reward. When I aced a test, Dad would brag about it to his coworkers. But when Alex got a decent grade, all he got was a dismissive, "That's nice, Alex." Looking back, I realize how unfair it all was. At the time, though, I didn't fully grasp what was happening. I just thought Alex was unlucky, or maybe not trying hard enough. It didn't help that he started acting out around the time he turned 6. He'd throw tantrums over small things or break our toys when he got frustrated. Chloe and I started seeing him as a troublemaker, someone who disrupted our lives and made everything harder for our parents. One memory stands out vividly. Chloe had just gotten a new dress for her birthday, a beautiful blue one she'd been begging for. Alex, in a fit of jealousy or frustration, ripped it while they were playing. Chloe was devastated, and I was furious. I yelled at him, calling him a brat. He didn't say anything, just ran to his room and slammed the door. Mom and Dad were even angrier, scolding him for hours. I thought they were justified at the time, but now I wonder if that was just the breaking point for all their pent-up resentment. Alex started withdrawing after that. He stopped trying to join in when Chloe and I played together. He spent more time alone, building forts out of pillows or drawing in a little notebook he kept hidden under his bed. I felt a twinge of guilt seeing him like that, but I was too young to understand what he was going through or my own role in it. By the time Alex was 8, it was clear to everyone that he was different. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made him stand out in our family. He was quieter, more sensitive, and he didn't fit into the mold my parents had created for us. While Chloe and I were praised for following the rules and meeting expectations, Alex was often reprimanded for being too messy, too loud, or too Alex. Our house, once filled with laughter and warmth, grew colder as the years went on. It felt like we were all tiptoeing around each other, trying not to set off the next argument or outburst. And in the middle of it all was Alex, a boy who just wanted to be loved the way Chloe and I were, but never seemed to get it. Looking back now, I wish I had been kinder to him. I wish I had stood up for him more, or at least tried to understand what he was going through. But at the time, I was just a kid, too caught up in my own world to see the bigger picture. I didn't realize how much Alex needed someone to be on his side, and I certainly didn't realize how much his presence and eventual absence would shape our family in ways none of us could have anticipated. Growing up in my household was a constant reminder that I wasn't wanted. I didn't understand it fully when I was little, but the favoritism toward my older sisters, Lily and Maya, was impossible to ignore. They got new clothes, treats, and endless praise for even the smallest accomplishments, while I was left with their discarded items, things that rarely fit or suited me. My mother didn't even try to hide her disdain. If I ever voiced how unfair it felt, I was scolded for being ungrateful, or worse, punished. By the time I was 6, the neglect and mistreatment began to weigh heavily on me. I felt like an outsider in my own family. My sisters were inseparable, and I was just the odd one out, the burden my parents didn't want but were stuck with. I started acting out, not because I wanted to cause trouble, but because I was desperate for someone, anyone, to notice me. Even negative attention felt better than being invisible. There was one particular incident that changed everything. It was during the holiday season, and Mom had just returned from a shopping trip with bags full of new clothes for Lily and Maya. They were so excited, showing off their shiny new dresses and jackets. I watched from the corner, hoping, just hoping, that there might be something for me too, but as usual there wasn't. Instead, Mom handed me a faded hand-me-down shirt from Maya that she'd outgrown months ago. It barely fit, and I could tell it was more of an afterthought than an actual gift. That evening, while my sisters were busy trying on their new outfits, I was left alone in my room, stewing in my frustration. I didn't plan what happened next, but something inside me snapped. I found a pair of scissors and cut their new clothes into tiny pieces. I didn't feel proud of it. I just felt overwhelmed by the unfairness of it all. It wasn't the right thing to do, but it was the only way I could express the hurt and anger I'd been bottling up. When Mom discovered what I'd done, she was livid. I still remember her voice shaking with rage as she screamed at me, calling me names I didn't fully understand at the time. Dad wasn't any better. For the first time, he seemed genuinely furious with me, though he was usually more indifferent than anything else. They didn't try to understand why I'd done it. They didn't ask. They didn't care. To them, I was just an ungrateful, troublesome child who had ruined everything. That night, they made a decision that would change my life forever. I overheard them talking in the kitchen while I sat on the stairs, clutching a blanket to my chest. "We can't keep dealing with him," Mom said sharply. "He's ruining this family." Dad sighed. "Maybe it's time to find someone else to take him. Someone who can handle him." Those words hit me like a freight train. I was only 6 years old, but I understood exactly what they meant. They were planning to get rid of me? I stayed awake all night, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of it. Part of me didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew it was true. The next few weeks were a blur. At first, they tried to find someone in our extended family who would take me, but no one was willing. Then, Dad heard about a couple in the next town over who had been trying to have a child for years, but hadn't been able to. They ran a small food truck business and were struggling financially, but they were eager to adopt. My parents didn't hesitate. I'll never forget the day Dad told me I was leaving. He didn't sit me down gently or try to explain why. It was a casual announcement, as if he were telling me we were going to the grocery store. "Pack your things," he said gruffly. "You're going to live with someone else." I didn't cry at first. I was too numb. But that night, as I lay in bed, the reality of what was happening hit me like a tidal wave. I cried quietly, pressing my face into the pillow so no one would hear. My sisters, meanwhile, were thrilled. They thought my leaving meant more attention and resources for them. It hurt to see how happy they were. The next morning, Dad loaded my small suitcase into the car. I remember standing on the porch looking back at the house one last time. Mom didn't even bother to say goodbye. She just waved me off like I was some unwanted guest who had overstayed his welcome. Lily and Maya were playing in the yard, completely uninterested in the fact that their brother was being sent away. The drive to my new home was silent. Dad didn't speak, and I didn't dare ask any questions. I stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of my hometown fade into something unfamiliar. When we arrived, I was greeted by John and Mary, my new parents. They looked kind and welcoming, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being unwanted. After all, if my own family didn't want me, why would these strangers? Dad didn't stay long. He handed them some paperwork, gave me a quick pat on the shoulder, and left without a second glance. As I watched his car disappear down the road, a part of me wanted to chase after him, to beg him to take me back. But I didn't. I just stood there holding my suitcase, feeling a strange mix of relief and heartbreak. John and Mary tried their best to make me feel at home. They showed me to my new room, a small, renovated storage room with a single bed and a tiny dresser. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had a space of my own. Still, I couldn't let my guard down. I was convinced that their kindness was temporary, that it was only a matter of time before they realized I wasn't worth the trouble and sent me away too. That first night in my new home, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering what my life would be like now. I didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would ultimately save me in ways I couldn't imagine. The day my parents decided Alex had to leave is one I'll never forget. It started like any other chaotic morning in our house. Rushed breakfast, misplaced backpacks, and arguments about who was hogging the bathroom. But by evening, everything had changed. The catalyst was Alex ruining Chloe's brand new dress. It wasn't just any dress. It was a birthday gift she had begged for months. She had only worn it once before. Alex, in one of his increasingly common tantrums, ripped it during a fight. Chloe's sobs echoed through the house as Mom inspected the torn fabric, her face a mix of fury and exhaustion. "I can't take this anymore," Mom muttered under her breath, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Dad, sitting silently on the couch, didn't argue. Alex stood frozen in the hallway, his small frame trembling, eyes wide with a mix of guilt and fear. I remember watching him and thinking he looked smaller than usual, like he was trying to disappear into the wallpaper. That night, my parents sat us all down in the living room. Their expressions were heavy, the kind of weight that settled not just on their faces, but in the air around us. Dad started talking about how hard things had been lately, how the constant chaos and stress were taking a toll on everyone. Mom chimed in, her voice wavering but resolute, saying they'd made a decision for the good of the family. They told us Alex would be moving to Grandma's house. At first, I didn't fully grasp what they were saying. Grandma lived a few towns over, far enough that it wasn't a quick drive. She was a kind woman, but she was old and lived alone. The idea of Alex staying there permanently felt surreal. It wasn't like we hadn't spent weekends there before, but this was different. This wasn't a visit. This was a transfer, a handing over. Alex didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the floor, his face pale. I wanted to ask questions, to understand why this was happening, but the look on my parents' faces told me it wasn't up for discussion. This was their decision, and nothing was going to change their minds. The next few days were a whirlwind. Mom and Dad packed up Alex's belongings in quiet efficiency, their movements robotic, as if doing this quickly would make it hurt less. I caught snippets of conversations between them, words like reset and fresh start, tossed around like solutions to a problem they didn't know how to solve. Chloe didn't seem to mind. If anything, she seemed relieved. "Maybe things will be normal again," she whispered to me one night. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me agreed. Alex's outbursts had been a constant source of tension, but another part of me felt uneasy, like we were all complicit in something we didn't fully understand. On the morning Alex left, the house was eerily quiet. He didn't throw a tantrum or beg to stay. He just followed Dad to the car, clutching a small backpack that looked too big for his thin shoulders. I watched from the living room window as they drove away, the pit in my stomach growing deeper with every second. Chloe sat beside me, flipping through a magazine, seemingly unbothered. "He'll be fine," she said, as if convincing herself more than me. Days turned into weeks, and life without Alex settled into a strange new normal. The house was quieter, less chaotic. Mom and Dad seemed more relaxed, though I noticed they didn't talk about Alex much. It was like he had been erased from our family's narrative, a chapter they'd rather not revisit. At first, I thought about Alex constantly. I wondered if he was okay at Grandma's, if she was able to handle his mood swings and outbursts. I considered asking Mom if we could visit him, but something always stopped me. Maybe it was fear of seeing how different things were for him, or fear of being reminded of how easily we'd let him go. But as time passed, those thoughts came less frequently. I got caught up in school, friends, and my own life. The gap Alex left in the family started to feel less like a wound and more like a scar, something we all adjusted to without really noticing. Occasionally, Grandma would call to give updates. She'd tell Mom and Dad how Alex was doing in school, how he was behaving, or if he needed anything. They listened politely but didn't ask many questions. Once, I overheard Grandma chastising Dad on the phone, her voice sharp and filled with disappointment. "He's your son, Mark. You don't just give up on your son." Dad didn't say much in response, just muttered something about doing what was best for everyone. After that, the calls seemed to come less often. Chloe and I rarely talked about Alex. She seemed happier without him around, and I didn't want to stir up old tensions. But sometimes, late at night, I'd find myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he missed us. Did he hate us for letting him go? Did he even think about us at all? Looking back, I realize how much I avoided confronting my own feelings about what happened. It was easier to push it aside, to tell myself that it wasn't my responsibility. I was just a kid, after all. What could I have done? But deep down, I knew the truth. I had been a silent bystander, complicit in my parents' decision to abandon Alex in a way that felt final, irreversible. I told myself it was for the best, that he was better off with Grandma. She was patient, kind, and understanding in a way my parents weren't. But that didn't erase the guilt, the nagging feeling that we had failed him as a family. And as much as I tried to bury those feelings, I knew they would resurface eventually. Because no matter how much distance we put between us and Alex, he was still my brother. And a part of me knew that the story wasn't over. Not for him, not for us. Years passed, and I built a life that I never imagined was possible. With John and Mary's unwavering support, I graduated college, started my own business, and eventually turned it into a small but thriving chain of cafes. They were there for every milestone, cheering me on like the proud parents they had become. To me, they were my real parents, the ones who chose me, believed in me, and gave me a future. I didn't think much about my biological family during those years. Occasionally, memories of their cruelty would surface, but I pushed them away. My life was better without them, and I didn't want to reopen old wounds. John and Mary filled the void they had left behind, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly loved and valued. Then, one afternoon, while I was managing one of my cafes, everything changed. I was at the counter going over receipts when a man walked in. At first, I didn't recognize him. He looked older, thinner, and worn down by life. But then he smiled, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. It was my biological father. I froze, unsure of what to do. He approached the counter with a wide grin, acting as though we were old friends. Before I could say anything, he pulled me into a hug. I didn't hug him back. I was too stunned, too overwhelmed by a flood of conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, and a tiny, reluctant twinge of sadness. "Look at you," he said, stepping back to take a good look at me. "You've done well for yourself. I'm proud of you." The words felt hollow, almost mocking. Where was this pride when I was a child? Desperate for his approval, I didn't say much, just nodded and muttered something polite. The cafe was busy, and I didn't want to cause a scene. He seemed oblivious to my discomfort and went on to tell me how he had run into John recently, who told him about my success. He then mentioned that he wanted to bring my biological mother to meet me that weekend. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to ask why he thought he had any right to be here after abandoning me. But another part of me, perhaps the part still carrying the scars of a neglected child, couldn't bring myself to push him away outright. So I nodded numbly and let him leave without making any promises. That evening, I told John and Mary what had happened. John, ever the voice of reason, said it was my decision whether to meet them again. Mary, on the other hand, encouraged me to forgive them and move on. "Holding on to anger only hurts you," she said gently. I knew she was right, but forgiveness didn't come easily, especially not for people who had caused me so much pain. By the time the weekend rolled around, I had reluctantly agreed to meet them, on the condition that John and Mary would be there with me. I wasn't ready to face my biological parents alone. They arrived at John and Mary's house late in the afternoon. My biological mother, Evelyn, looked almost exactly as I remembered, stern, with a permanent frown etched into her face. She greeted me with a stiff hug and immediately launched into a monologue about how grateful I should be that they had found John and Mary to take me in. "We did what was best for you," she said, as if it had been some grand act of sacrifice rather than an act of rejection. I bit my tongue, determined not to let her get under my skin. John sat beside me, his presence a silent reminder that I didn't have to face this alone. Mary held my hand under the table, grounding me in a way only she could. As the meeting dragged on, it became clear that they weren't there to apologize or reconcile. Instead, they seemed more interested in taking credit for my success. My father, Greg, even joked that I should be thanking them for finding such great parents for me. It took everything in me not to explode. When the conversation turned to money, I finally had enough. Evelyn started talking about how difficult things had been for them lately, how Greg had lost his steady job and she was struggling to make ends meet. "You're doing so well," she said, her tone almost accusatory. "The least you could do is help us out." I stared at her, stunned by her audacity. "You abandoned me," I said quietly, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. "You made it clear I wasn't your responsibility, so why should I be responsible for you now?" She bristled at my words, her face turning red. "Don't you forget where you came from," she snapped. "You owe us. Everything you've achieved is because we gave you a chance at a better life." John's hand landed on my shoulder, a gentle reminder to stay calm. I took a deep breath and said, "You're wrong. Everything I've achieved is because of John and Mary, not you. They gave me love, support, and a home when you wouldn't. I owe you nothing." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but Greg put a hand on her arm, shaking his head. They left shortly after, their faces a mix of anger and embarrassment. I felt a strange sense of relief as the door closed behind them. For years I had carried the weight of their rejection, wondering if there was something wrong with me that made them leave. But now, I saw the truth. Their actions had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with their own flaws. John and Mary hugged me tightly that night, reminding me once again of the family I had found, the family that chose me. I didn't know if my biological parents would try to contact me again, but one thing was certain. I wouldn't let them take anything more from me, not my money, not my peace, and certainly not the life I had worked so hard to build. I thought that meeting would be the end of it. I had said my piece, drawn a line in the sand, and made it clear that I wasn't going to let my biological parents manipulate me. For a while, it seemed like they understood, or at least accepted, the boundaries I'd set. But a few weeks later, Evelyn called me again. I hesitated before answering, my thumb hovering over the screen. A part of me wanted to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe she was finally ready to apologize. Maybe, just maybe, she wanted to make things right. I was wrong. "Your sisters need help," she began, skipping any semblance of small talk. "They've had to drop out of college because we can't afford their tuition. You've done so well for yourself. Surely you can help them out." Her words hit me like a slap. I barely remembered my sisters Lily and Maya from when I was a child. We hadn't spoken in years, and now I was expected to fund their education. "Evelyn," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I don't think that's something I can do." She didn't take the rejection well. Her tone turned sharp, accusing. "They're your family. Don't you feel any responsibility for them? After everything we did for you?" I cut her off, my patience thinning. "What exactly did you do for me?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "You left me behind. You never called, never checked in. And now, after 20 years, you want me to pay for their education. That doesn't sound like family to me." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, in a voice dripping with bitterness, she said, "You've changed. We gave you a chance at a better life, and this is how you repay us. You're selfish." Selfish. That word stung, but not for the reasons she intended. For years, I had carried the guilt of not being enough for them, of not being the child they wanted. But now I realized that their version of family was transactional. It wasn't about love or connection. It was about what they could take from me. "I owe you nothing," I said, my voice steady. "The life I have now is because of John and Mary, not you. I'm sorry you're struggling, but I can't help you." I hung up before she could respond, my heart pounding. The anger and frustration lingered long after the call ended. I knew I'd made the right decision, but it didn't make it any easier. It was painful to be reminded of the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, but saw me only as a means to an end. Over the next few days, Evelyn tried calling again, but I didn't answer. Eventually, the calls stopped. I focused on my life, pouring my energy into my work and spending time with John and Mary. They reassured me that I had made the right choice, that I wasn't responsible for people who had abandoned me, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sadness, not for Evelyn or Greg, but for the idea of what could have been, what family should have been. I let that sadness remind me of what I'd gained instead, a real family in John and Mary, built on love, respect, and choice, and that was enough for me. After blocking our parents, Ryan disappeared from my life entirely. I thought I'd feel anger or resentment for his refusal to help, but instead, I was left with this hollow ache. Over time, it became clear that the damage wasn't just the immediate fallout of our choices, it was the years we let slip by without making amends. I didn't hear anything for months. Occasionally, Mom or Dad would mention trying to contact Ryan again, but their frustration was palpable. Their pride, the same stubborn pride that had driven him away, now left them stuck. They wouldn't acknowledge what they'd done, and they couldn't understand why he refused to move forward without that admission. For me, guilt festered quietly. I replayed moments from our childhood in my mind, the small ways I would have supported him, the times I stayed silent when he needed an ally. The realization that I had let him shoulder so much of our family's dysfunction alone was crushing. It was too late to undo the past, but I wished I'd done more to bridge the gap before it became a canyon. One night, I sat down with my parents and asked them, point blank, if they'd ever considered apologizing. The question landed like a blow. Dad scoffed, muttering something about how Ryan just wanted to humiliate us, while Mom looked genuinely hurt. "It's not like we didn't love him," she said, her voice breaking. "We just didn't know how to handle it." "But that's the problem," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You didn't handle it. You left him to figure it out on his own." For the first time, I saw a flicker of acknowledgement in Mom's eyes, but it faded just as quickly. Dad, on the other hand, dismissed me entirely. "What's done is done. If he can't let go, that's on him." And that's when I realized the truth. They would never change, not for me, not for Ryan, not even for themselves. I tried reaching out to Ryan one last time, sending a message through social media. I kept it simple, apologizing for not being there when he needed me most, and letting him know I was proud of the life he'd built. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't get one, but I meant every word. Months turned into years, and life moved forward. I heard through extended family that Ryan was thriving, his business was expanding, and he'd even started mentoring kids with similar struggles to the ones he'd faced. It stung that I had to hear about him secondhand, but I was glad he was doing well. He deserved that. As for my parents, they continued to spiral in their own guilt and denial. My brother's struggles never really ended. His recovery was slow and their finances remained strained. I tried to help where I could, but I couldn't fill the void Ryan left behind. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that little boy who wore hand-me-down clothes and just wanted to belong. I think about the weight Ryan carried, not just of his own challenges, but of our family's inability to support him. And I think about how far he's come despite it all. I don't know if I'll ever see him again, but I hope he knows that. Even if I couldn't say it when it mattered most, I'm sorry. I hope he's found the peace we never gave him. And I hope, wherever he is, he feels the pride and love I should have shown him long ago.